Okay, so today on probability, we're going to look at experimental probability, and to do that, we're going to revise some terminology first. Okay, so we're just going to revise some of our terminology here. So the first thing, obviously, we should remember is that a trial is the act of doing an experiment in probability. So that could be something like rolling a dice, or rolling a die if it's just one. Okay, so that's the first thing that we need to remember. Okay, and we're going to stick with this die analogy, or rolling a die analogy, as we go on through these definitions, just to help us distinguish and remind ourselves. Okay, so the next definition that we want to look at is an outcome. So an outcome is one of the possible results. So for example, we could get rolling a 6. Okay, on the die. All right, very straightforward. Okay, and so more importantly then, the list of all possible outcomes in the trial is called the sample space. So sticking with our die analogy, well, the sample space for rolling the die is, if it's a normal die, is to get a 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. That's all the possible outcomes there. Okay, and so the event then is the actuality, so when it actually happens, or the occurrence of a specific outcome. So an event could be the die landing on the 6. Okay, so that's, I suppose, the distinction there. Okay, let's move on. And just before we do, make sure that, again, that you write down these into your notes copy. Okay, and just to remind ourselves then, just a quick glance at the probability scale. So again, we can see, I suppose the important part here is obviously that the probability scale ranges between 0 and 1, okay? And I'll just write in a 1 here. Okay, so that's the maximum range, or any event can only lie, the chances of it happening so are always just between 0 and 1. So here we'll just write down, so P of A, to remind ourselves, can only be between 0 and 1. Okay, so that's any event happening. Then obviously, as we reminded ourselves the other day, very importantly, the probability of an event happening and the probability of it not happening all add up to give you 1, which means if we want to get the probability of something happening and we know the chances of it not happening, we can just rearrange this algebraically. Okay, so for example, something like this, and again, this is going to be really important for us, so that the probability of it not happening is 1 minus the probability of it happening. So just those two bits really important about the probability scale. And then obviously, the closer a probability is to 0, the less likely it is that it will happen, and the closer it is to 1, the more likely it's going to happen. Okay, and so lastly, we're going to look at relative frequency. Another name for it is experimental probability, because it's the act of doing experiments or doing trials. So experimental probability. Okay, again, it's another concept that we touched on in junior cert. So relative frequency, similar to our normal definition for probability, is that the frequency or number of times the event happens in a trial over the total number of trials. And again, really important, our relative frequency will be more accurate the more trials that we conduct. So it has greater accuracy, so by increasing the number of trials. Okay, so let's do a quick question and then we're done. Okay, so in this question, we're told that Michelle conducts an experiment to show how the number of trials improves as the accuracy, or improves the accuracy of the relative frequency. So just like we said in the previous slide, that as we conduct more trials, the relative frequency improves. Okay, and so she wants to show this in this question. So Michelle flips a fair coin and records her results here. And we're asked to plot the relative frequency of tails on a trend graph. Okay. Okay, so we're asked to plot it, the relative frequency of tails on the trend graph. So that's the figure that we're going to look for in each of the tables. Okay, so the first one, after 10 flips, it has a relative frequency of 0.4. Then after 20, it's a relative frequency of 0.35. After 30, it's a relative frequency of 0.57. So somewhere up around here. After 40 flips, it's 0.55. So just below that. And then after 50 flips, 0.52, and just right there. Okay, and so it's a trend graph that we're asked to do, so we just need to join these with straight lines. Okay, so that's our trend graph. So then the second part of the question asks us, is the relative frequency of 0.35 more likely after 20 flips or after 50 flips? Well, we can see anyway at 20 flips, it was a relative frequency of 0.35, but that's not how we get the answer here. We get it by drawing in our actual probability. So the chances of getting tails is a half. It's a 1 in 2 chance, which is 0.5. So I'm just going to plot that in a dashed line. So that's our actual or our theoretical probability. So that line is plotted there. And basically, we will be saying as an answer of part 2 that it's more likely to get an answer of 0.35 after 20 flips. And why? Because the actual probability in this case is equal to 0.5 equals 0.5, and as we have said, the relative frequency increases. As you increase the number of trials, the relative frequency becomes more accurate. So as we go towards conduct, or so after 50 flips, we would expect it to be closer, it should be closer to the actual probability. Okay, so that's it. Okay, so make sure that you get all of these notes down into your copy, and then keep an eye on Schoology for questions.